So, are you a driver or a rider?
On BlaBlaCar.
Yeah, of course.
I'm actually both, you know what? I used both. And the thing to understand is actually the community. We have more than a third of the community doing both. So people change. So we don't think of like riders or driver on BlaBlaCar. We think of members, and people do whatever they want. So sometimes you can offer a ride in your car, and the next day you might take a ride with someone else.
Cool. So do you use BlaBlaCar to go on weekends or stuff like that? What kind of use case do you have personally?
So the use case I had for quite some time, actually, and now I use it in different places of Europe, but the use case I had for quite some time was actually Brussels to Paris, because I was in Brussels. Actually, I am still in Brussels, so I'm commuting between the two pretty often. And I've been testing the service in the early days, actually a lot between the two cities, mostly as a driver back in those days.
Cool. So instead of taking the train, basically you're taking a BlaBlaCar because it's cheaper. There's a community aspect. That's all the things you are saying are working for BlaBlaCar, right?
Really, I do both. When I want to go fast and pay lots of money, I take the train.
A lot of money,
when I have a bit more time, I take a BlaBlaCar, and it really depends on the route.
Cool. So funny thing, last year I interviewed your other co-founder, Fred Mazella.
Yep.
But since then, you've had quite a big year, I would say. You've raised $200 million at a 1.6 billion valuation.
Yep.
So what are you going to do with all this money?
So if I look at what we're going to do with the money, but what we've done in the last year, essentially, a year ago the focus was still very much Europe, right? So it was about setting up shop in Europe, being in every country in Europe. And what we decided to do about a year ago, and what probably Fred mentioned actually on stage a year ago, was the willingness to go global. And we've done that when we were not done being European. And in fact, we're still not done being European. Right? We're still expanding all over Europe. We're still growing very fast in Europe. But we decided, OK, we need a step change. We need to try to go global. And global for us meant not really going to the US, which is often what it means when people go global, actually. It was going to emerging markets. So a year ago, we started Russia by acquisition. We acquired a company, and we got into Russia and Ukraine, which is very interesting. And we've seen phenomenal growth in Russia. And we decided, hey, it works outside of Europe. We have a fantastic proof point in a big market outside of Europe. And frankly, it's pretty unusual for a French company to launch a country like Russia, or even like any European company. And we thought we need to double down on that strategy. And we went out, raised $200 million, so 2 times more than what we raised last year. And we started to launch Turkey, India, Mexico, and last week, Brazil.
So now you're in what, 20 countries around the world?
So today we're in 20 countries. What's fascinating is 20% of the
How many members do you have?
So we have close to 25 million members today on the platform. And the thing that's pretty exciting is 50% of the member growth, the new member growth of the company, is actually today coming from emerging markets. Okay. So if you think of that bet we made like a year or a bit more than a year ago, it's paying off big time today.
Okay. What do you think makes BlaBlaCar work in all these countries? Why do people in Russia like BlaBlaCar?
Well, I think at the end of the day, so if I go back in time, right, when we started BlaBlaCar, Fred, Francis, and I, actually, when we pitched the company, the first few times, people told us, like, forget it, it's never going to work, people are never going to share their car, it's personal, it's never going to work. When it started to work in France, then people told us, hold on, it probably works in France because it's a socialist country and it's very special. It's never going to work outside of France. So we said, all right. And then we started to scale in Spain and in Italy. And then people thought, OK, it's working because it's Southern Europe. It's a Southern European behavior. And then it worked in Germany, and it works in Poland, and it works in Russia, and it works in India. So at the end of the day, you get to believe that there is something a bit more fundamental than just culture. You need to adapt to culture. But I think we're creating like a very powerful win-win proposition. And wherever you have cars and wherever you have people wanting to travel between cities, it just makes sense. It just makes sense because we're enabling drivers that would drive anyway to save money, to offset their cost. And by doing so, and by creating this cost-sharing model where all you do as a driver is offsetting your cost of driving, you're creating a super low-cost transport network. So today, I was taking like Brussels to Paris as an example, but if we take an example here in the UK, London, Manchester, you can do that for £20. Right? It's like a fourth or a fifth of a train ticket for a passenger. And for a driver, if you get 3 passengers, you end up collecting £60 on the way, £60 on the way back, £120 for something you would do anyway. So I think the proposition is such, it's such a win-win proposition that the real thing we're doing is how do you create enough trust in a community so that you unlock transactions? And that's what we need to worry about in every market.
So how hard is it to open new markets and build this kind of trust with new customers? Starting a community from scratch, really.
Yeah, so it's about, I mean, given we're very domestic, so if you think of the use case of BlaBlaCar, people don't use BlaBlaCar to go from Paris to Moscow, obviously.
Yeah.
Right, so they're going to stay in France. So when we started BlaBlaCar in France, we quickly realized that there's going to be no cross-pollination of communities in different countries, which is very different when you do Airbnb, because people travel between countries. So before you know it, you have apartments in Paris, you have Americans renting them, and you have this like global cross-pollination taking place. We don't have that. So we need to build country by country. And the need for liquidity initially is extremely hard to get, because you need like lots of drivers, lots of passengers in the same time to match. Right? So the challenge we have to face every time is, on one side, you need to build trust between people. So in a way, if you want to build trust, you need to ask for lots of information when people sign up. And on the other side, you need to build liquidity. You need to get lots and lots of people to sign up and use the service. And what we do is market by market, we need to balance that. So we've built like a proper expansion playbook. And market by market, we look at the merit of trust in the initial phase and how many partnership and marketing we can do to scale, and we find the right balance. And today, I would say that's probably what we get very good at in the last 2 or 3 years, is like refining a recipe so that when you go to country number 20, you have the learning from like 19 countries you've done, and you know pretty much what to do, what not to do, and
so
then you adapt.
You're doing the same thing in every market, basically, because you're talking about this expansion playbook.
Yeah.
What is in this playbook?
So it's mostly like how do you adapt your product to your local market? It's like what marketing channels do you use? What partnerships you would do? How do you price the ride? How do you manage the community? What do you need to ask for to create trust? And then you realize that your markets tend to bundle into different groups. So for example, today we see Europe as a pretty uniform group, where what you need to do to create a trusted community in Europe is pretty similar in most countries. And then you go to India, and you go to Brazil, and you realize it's a completely different game. So then we need to reinvent a bit of a playbook for emerging market, where building trust is different than in Germany, for example.
So what's your most promising market today? Is it India, Mexico, Brazil?
It's a good question. I would say today the most amazing is probably Russia.
Russia. Okay.
We launched Russia like a bit more than a year ago, and Russia has become, like within less than a year, the fastest growing market of all. So it's growing faster than all the European markets.
And isn't Russia too big for this kind of service?
No, because actually it's almost like, think of it as multiple countries in a way, right? If you think of Russia or India, you end up having people like West Russia and east part of Russia pretty active, but most of the population in Russia end up being around Moscow and West Russia. And we see like amazing traffic, amazing adoption in Russia. So I would say it's been like an amazing surprise for us. We never thought it would be that fast in Russia in terms of adoption. And then the most promising, I would say, India is super exciting. Not just because it's a big market, but because in India, I think we're solving for a very different problem. So if you think of the problem we're solving in Europe, it's about low-cost transport, right? So we're providing this like fantastic last-minute low-cost travel, where you can travel from Paris to Brussels, from London to Manchester for like 20 euro. It's unheard of. In India, we're not solving the same problem. In India, we're not doing low-cost transport. In India, we're creating an infrastructure that's not there. So if you ask people in India, like, how do you go from Delhi to Chandigarh for a weekend or to visit your family? People would say, well, actually, I can't. Because if I try to book a train, the train is fully booked. And I don't have a car. So I cannot go.
So you have this option on BlaBlaCar, women only. Is it popular in India or Russia or these new countries?
So we use it everywhere. It's used in very different ways, right? So in Europe, what we tend to see is most women would use this like ladies-only feature. And then over time, they disable it very quickly because they trust the community and they activate
based on ratings and
based on reviews, based on verification that took place. Now, if you look at countries like India, initially we end up building a lot more of a male-dominated marketplace.
Okay.
Right. So essentially, we end up having like today mostly like 80-90% male on the Indian platform. And I think over time, we'll need to probably win a female audience by building more trust. But initially, the mix, if you look at France, Germany, Spain, it's almost 50-50, male-female. And emerging market, we're more of a male-dominated marketplace.
And then there's France. Because I've heard rumors about your latest fundraising efforts, saying that France is actually growing like crazy for BlaBlaCar, still.
Yep.
So I think you have 8 million members right now in France.
Yep.
So that's like 1 out of 5 adults.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? What's the limit?
So I think what's interesting is like there's the thing that's been misunderstood about BlaBlaCar for years. It was market size and market potential. So what we tried to explain in the early days was, okay, if we do it right, essentially, most people travel in Europe using their car. So we tend to think that the Germans, the French actually use the train and use the buses to travel between cities. True, but 80% of the time they use their car.
Yeah.
So if you allow actually people to share their car when they travel between cities, you have a shot at building the biggest transport network between cities in the world or in Europe for that matter. And if you think of like creating trust in a community, once you create trust, there is kind of no stopping. Like it's really a mainstream sort of middle class product that at some point every French people, every European should use, right? So it's our job essentially, how do we make that trustworthy enough, reliable enough, so that at the end of the day, anyone would want to take a BlaBlaCar between Paris and Brussels.
So let's talk about legislation a bit. So as everybody knows, I guess, Uber had some issues in Paris with taxi drivers blocking the streets, Uber having to shut down, Uber Pop and stuff like that. And you didn't get affected at all. Yeah. Why is that?
So the thing to understand is there is almost like, I would say a semantic confusion around what people call ride sharing.
So it's not ride sharing, Uber Pop?
Well, I would say no, it's not really ride sharing. I mean, to me, like, but the point is a bit different. So there's a semantic confusion mostly in English around what people call ride sharing. So if you look at the market today, I think it splits in two very different things, right? So on one side, you have what Uber is doing, what Lyft is doing, what Halo is doing, which is on demand, in city, and professional driver-led type marketplaces. So if you look at that, whether it's called UberX, UberPop, or any Uber, essentially you're pressing a button, the driver is coming, you tell the driver where you want to go, and the driver is going to drive you where you want to go. So essentially what you do is you pay for labor plus a car to carry you from point A to point B. But the driver is not going to point B, the driver is driving you to point B. And then you have what we do, which is mostly long distance, scheduled, so it's something you plan like a day or two in advance. And actually what you do is you find another person that happens to go from Paris to Brussels anyway, without you, and then you end up sharing that vehicle to go together. Okay. So in that model, which is what we do at BlaBlaCar, you don't pay for labor, you don't pay for the driver because the driver is going anyway. So you end up with like a price model on a per mile basis that's completely different, right? Okay. So if you look at Uber, you're going to be paying typically like $1 to $3 per mile because you're paying for labor. And on BlaBlaCar, you pay 10 cents per mile on longer distances. So you have like a 10 to 30x difference on the price per mile for what you pay, right? So it's two very different models. And from a regulation point of view, it's also two very different things because on one side of the equation, you end up essentially having a professional person giving a ride. So whoever needs to be regulated by the transport authorities or the labor authorities in California is a different debate, but it's someone doing a job as opposed to someone sharing something you would do anyway. So it's two very different markets.
And how do you make sure someone is not going to put Paris to Lyon travel so that he can get clients?
Yeah, so we ensure that by controlling the price of the marketplace.
So you're controlling everything.
Yeah, so essentially when you offer a ride between, let's say, Paris and Brussels or London and Manchester, we're going to say, okay, the fair price of sharing is X, and then you can decrease or increase a bit, and then we cap the maximum price you can offer per seat. So we make sure that you can never make a profit on BlaBlaCar. And essentially by doing that, you solve three issues, right? You solve the regulation issue. So we never had any regulation issues in Europe, and it's pretty powerful. You solve the tax issue, because essentially like your drivers don't need to declare taxes because they're just offsetting a cost. Yeah. And importantly as well, actually you solve an insurance issue, because suddenly like the driver's insurance is going to insure the passengers. You don't need a special insurance. So one of the reasons we've been able to scale, I would say, so fast, but also pretty efficiently, has been the fact that we found a way to scale within the regulation framework, essentially in Europe and anywhere in the world, right? So we had no regulation challenge, and when Uber was going through this phase with UberPop, when people look and understand the two different businesses, they realize you're dealing with two very different things. So
many people said that Uber is this kind of scary American company in France, and you got lucky because you're actually based in Paris, your HQ is in Paris, and you're this sweet little darling in Paris. So do you think it has a role in the legislation aspect as well?
Frankly, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think the way Uber has been regulated, not regulated in cities in Europe, is the fact that it's a US company or not a US company. If anything, I think Europe has always been very, very welcoming for.
Oh yeah, definitely. France is one of the biggest markets for Uber, so you're definitely right.
So I don't think it's the case. And if you look at the case of UberPop, I think essentially it's been banned right now in like every every country in Europe, right? So it was more of you need to change the law, so it's a hard thing to do.
Okay. So let's talk about your acquisition strategy, because you've been making quite a lot of acquisitions over the years.
Yep.
What are you looking for? Are you going to buy other companies in other countries?
So we've done, it's a good point actually, the way we expanded into 20 countries is by doing 8 acquisitions already, right? So in the last 3 years,
acquisitions.
we've been buying 8 companies. But most of the time, the key was to find a great team doing more or less what we do in another country. So that's how we get into Italy, that's how we get into Germany, Poland, Eastern Europe,
Was it early
Russia.
stage or late stage?
Very early stage.
Except Germany, I would guess.
That's the exception. So except this one, it's very early stage. It's typically like a company of like 2, 3, 4 people, smart guys.
Okay.
That we believe can run the country better than anyone else. So the whole idea was like, let's find entrepreneurs in these countries running something like BlaBlaCar, and we give them like lots of autonomy to run the country on their own. And then in a way, we help them with product and technology because we have like a uniform platform, funding because the company is well funded, and playbook and marketing recipes. But then they own the country and they manage the country pretty autonomously.
Cool. So it's more like acqui-hires, really.
It was like definitely a acqui-hire strategy.
They have the BlaBlaCar brand afterwards and stuff like that.
So there are 2 things we do. It's always we unify the brand as we do this M&A growth strategy. We unify the brand and we unify technology as well. So it's single product, single technology platform.
Okay, so let's talk about the business side now. How are you making money today?
So we're making money the way most marketplaces make money. So we take a fee in the transaction.
Okay.
So if you're a driver and you're offering a ride for 20 euro between Paris and Brussels, I'm going to end up paying 22, and 2 is going to get, roughly speaking, right, 10%.
So it's 10%?
It's roughly 10%. So it varies market to market from 8 to 14%, I believe.
So 8 to 14%, okay. And are you going to have other products, other revenue streams in the future, or is it going to be fees?
I think the main one is always going to be based on this activity because that's the core activity. But then over time, I mean, you can imagine all kind of other things, right? Okay. So you could imagine, I mean, essentially the way we think of it is we're building 2 things. We're building like a massive transport network that people use to travel between cities, but we're also building like a massive trusted community. Right, so then, frankly, it's up to our imagination what you can do on both. You can imagine delivery on the transport network. You can imagine insurance product on the community because we have a deal with AXA all over Europe. So I think over time, there are lots of new things we can build, and not just to monetize, just to add more value to the community.
So you're going to replace passenger with packages, basically, at some point?
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, at the end
Do you see people already doing that on the platform?
So that's exactly the key. It's like you look at what people do, and typically it's guiding us.
Yeah.
So that's the beauty of having these communities. You just ask them. So you just see what they're doing. So if they start like carrying guitars and cats across the country, then you think like, okay, well maybe we should organize for that because people are doing that, right? And we should do it better, and we should maybe provide an insurance for that, and we should help them do that. So we gather some feedback and we see what people do, what people don't do, what people are willing to transact, to buy, or to do in the community. So we use the community as an echo chamber for new ideas, essentially.
So I'm sure many people in the room are dying to know what's going to happen to BlaBlaCar in 2 years or 3 years. Are you going to raise more money, or are you looking for an IPO?
So to me, it's the same thing, by the way. Huh? Raising money and doing an IPO is probably the same, but
well, yeah, of course, raising money. But
so I don't think of the IPO as something like so symbolic, to be honest.
Okay.
So we're not really focusing on we need to IPO in a year, or we need to IPO in 3 years, or we need to IPO at all. Today we're focusing on building the business, as fast as we can, as big as we can, as sensibly as we can. And as you do that, I think the path to an IPO becomes clear, or something else happens. Now, in terms of raising more money, probably we will actually, right? Because to me, it's more opportunistic, right? So if you see that you launch India and things like India are taking off, and you become bullish and you want to launch more market in Asia, for example, yes, most likely at some point we'll realize, if we want to be more aggressive in the region, we need to raise more money, and it's part of the game. So most likely we'll raise more money in the private market in the years to come. Maybe, maybe not.
So as long as you can find money, you're going to raise money?
No, as long as we can transform money into value, essentially we do that. So to me, it's like you launch India, essentially, if I take the $200 million as an example, it was, you see this emerging market taking off, and then you decide, geez, no one is doing it, we should do it. How do you launch Mexico, Brazil, India, and Turkey in 1 year? Then quickly you realize, okay, we need more capital to do that. And it's a good story, and you raise money on that story because you have a proof point that it's working already on 1 or 2 markets. So if we think of Asia, where we've done nothing so far, and we want to scale in Asia and still grow India and Latin America, maybe it makes sense to go and raise more money. But again, it's really based on we see something where we can deploy that capital sensibly.
Cool. Thank you very much, Nicolas.
Thank
so
you.
there you have it. BlaBlaCar, ride sharing all over the world.
Thanks.